GameBuilder Studio.
Until now, in GameBuilder Studio, you've only had the ability to listen to a collision event and respond to that event. Now, what if you wanted to get a little bit more information about what's going on during a collision? Whether you want to determine where the collision happened, what the collision point is, the angle of the collision, or exactly who you're colliding with. Well, now in GameBuilder Studio, you have the ability to do that. There are some new properties available under Game Current Collision Data. You now have access to the information to tell you what is the colliding entity, what is the entity's name, the shape or the collision shape that you are colliding with. Collision shapes now have a name, and I'll show you that in a minute. And the colliding spatial, as well as the normal, which is like the angle of collision, and the collision point in world space. I have a scene here that has two balls set up, and on the spatial they're defined as a ball using the object type tag. Now, I could have said this is the red ball and blue ball, but then I would have to set up logic with additional conditions to check for both types. But what if I wanted to read the strength of the property or the property called strength on each ball to determine how much damage to inflict? Well, now you can do that. When you listen for the collision event, you can put a conditional action here or have a condition up here that actually checks the game current collision data, and then you could check the collider entity and then use the dot syntax to access a component on that entity. Or if I wanted to isolate the collision to a particular shape on that object, if this object had two shapes, like a head and a body or something like that, or a weapon and a body, you could check the actual collider shape, name, and filter out the collision that way as well. In this scene, I have a ball that can collide with this wall, and I have a little collision point object here that I'm going to spawn right at the point of collision. So let's run this. Now I can drag this ball around, and if I touch it against the wall, you should see object spawning multiple spawn points. But if I was just spawning one, you would see just one appear right at the point of collision. One thing I'd like to note is that if you're accessing any of these properties are only available immediately after the collision event is triggered. So if you have a timer or a delay action in here, make sure that you store whatever property you need if you're trying to access it at a later point in time in the frame of your game. Store this somewhere locally in a local property and then access it that way. Otherwise, the property may be incorrect or invalid by the time you check it later. And if you do store one of these objects, like the spatial or the entity, these are actual data objects. So you want to make sure to clear whatever property you store, clear it out later so there's no memory leak or anything in your game. That's just a little FYI. Okay, collision shapes now have a name property. So if you have multiple collision shapes on an object, you can determine the difference between the different shapes using this name property and use that for collision filtering or checking collisions with specific body parts to determine maybe headshots in a beat 'em up game or something like that. So a perfect example is using spine. The spine animation editor allows you to put bounding boxes around different parts of your character. So it has a body or head. So say I had the Spine Boy animation and he has a gun and I was shooting an enemy and I want to give bonus points for headshots. You could now determine the collision happened with the bullet, and you could determine if it was a collision with the head of the character, and you could give bonus points for that collision.